Chapter 1. The Quiet Before the Storm. The last customer left an hour ago. Rain hammered against the large glass window of the daily grind, each drop a tiny fist trying to get in. Linda Ravenhart wiped down the gleaming espresso machine, the rhythmic squeak of the cloth a familiar comfort in the growing quiet. Outside, the world was a blur of gray water and howling wind. Inside, it was her sanctuary. The rich, dark scent of coffee beans and steamed milk clung to the air, a warm blanket against the storm's chill. Her reflection stared back at her from the window, a pale ghost against the thrashing trees. Dark hair, tired eyes. A woman who had learned to find peace in being alone because the alternative was a pain she refused to ever feel again. A quiet promise she'd made to herself echoed in her mind, a mantra worn smooth with time. I don't save wolves anymore. Not after Michael. Not after he'd taken her trust, her heart, her magic, and shattered them all for a bit of pack status. The memory was a cold stone in her gut. Continuing on with her duties, she moved through the cozy café, her footsteps soft on the worn wooden floor. She straightened the small, mismatched chairs and wiped the last crumbs from a little round table. This place was her life now. Predictable. Safe. No alphas with hungry eyes and slick promises. No pack politics that chewed up good people and spat them out. Just the gentle hiss of the milk steamer, the low hum of the refrigerator, and the distant cry of gulls on the coastal wind. It was a small life, but it was hers, and she had built it wall by wall to keep the monsters out. She poured herself a cup of black coffee, the steam warming her face as the lights above flickered, protesting the storm's fury. This particular night, however, felt different. The wind wasn't just blowing, it was screaming. It clawed at the roof and rattled the door in its frame, a desperate animal trying to break in. Linda took a sip of her coffee, the bitter heat a welcome distraction. Why did storms always make her think of him? Maybe because their end had been a storm, too. A hurricane of lies and betrayal that had left her stranded, a lone survivor on the wreckage of her own life. She traced a circle on the fogged-up window pane, her thoughts drifting to a silver locket she'd thrown into the ocean years ago. Another broken promise. Another piece of herself she had let go of because holding on hurt too much. Then, through the roar of the wind and the relentless drumming of the rain, another sound cut through the noise. It was high and thin at first, then it deepened into something guttural, something agonizing. Linda froze, the mug halfway to her lips. That wasn't an animal caught in the storm. It wasn't the wind playing tricks on the old building. It was a sound she recognized deep in her bones, a sound from the world she had run away from. It was a scream of pain, raw and primal, a scream that belonged to a wolf. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird in a cage. No. Don't you dare. She stood perfectly still, listening, praying it was her imagination. But it came again, closer this time, followed by a wet, heavy thud against the front door of her café. Someone was out there, someone was hurt, and every instinct she had screamed at her to turn up the music, to ignore it, to let the storm wash it all away. Chapter 2. The Wolf at the Door. The heavy thud echoed the frantic beat of her own heart. Silence followed, thick and terrifying, broken only by the storm's endless rage. Linda stood frozen behind the counter, her knuckles white where she gripped its edge. Her mind was a battlefield. One voice, the voice of survival, screamed at her to stay put. It's not your problem. Remember what happened last time. Remember Michael's smile just before he broke you. But another voice, a softer, older one she thought she had buried long ago, whispered back. It was the healer in her, the part of her that couldn't stand to hear suffering and do nothing. Another pained groan, low and deep, vibrated through the wooden door. It was the sound that made the choice for her, because she was a coward in so many ways, but she couldn't be a monster. With a shaking hand, she flicked the deadbolt. The door swung inward with a groan, pulled by the wind, and the storm rushed in, flinging rain and leaves across the floor. And there, collapsed on her welcome mat, was a man. Or the shape of a man. He was huge, a mountain of wet leather and denim, his broad shoulders slumped in defeat. Dark hair was plastered to his forehead, and his face was a mask of pain. But it was the scent that hit her first. The coppery tang of blood, sharp and overwhelming, mixed with the wild, clean smell of pine needles and wet earth, and under it all the unmistakable scent of a wolf. For a moment, all she could do was stare. His jacket was torn at the shoulder, the flesh beneath mangled and dark. Silver. The wounds reeked of it, a scent that made her stomach clench with a phantom, burning memory. This was an alpha. She could feel the power rolling off him in waves, even as weakened as he was. An alpha was at her door, bleeding out from a hunter's poison. The irony was so thick she could have choked on it. She grabbed his arm, her own strength barely enough, and dragged him inside, away from the hungry storm. He was impossibly heavy, all dense muscle and bone. She managed to get the door shut, the bolt sliding home with a click that sounded deafeningly final. Now he was in her space. Her safe, quiet, predictable world was suddenly filled with the dangerous presence of this stranger. He lay on her floor, his breathing shallow and ragged. Water pooled around him, dark with his own blood. Her training took over before she could think. She knelt beside him, her hands hovering over his wounds. The silver poisoning was aggressive. She could see the dark veins spreading from the cuts. He would be dead in an hour if she did nothing, and she hated herself for it. But the thought of helping him felt like a betrayal of the promise she had made to herself. He was one of them. The very creatures who had taught her that love was a weapon and trust was for fools. But his eyes? They suddenly snapped open and locked onto hers. They weren't brown or blue or green. They were gold, a startling, luminous gold like molten honey, and they stared at her with a shocking intensity. There was pain in them, yes, but there was something else too, a flicker of disbelief, of recognition. As if he had been crawling through a desert his whole life and had just stumbled upon the only well in the world. Her breath hitched. She had to check his pulse, to see how far the poison had gone. Hesitantly, she reached out, her fingers brushing against the pulse point on his thick neck. The moment her skin touched his, it happened. A jolt, brighter and more powerful than any lightning strike, arced between them. It wasn't painful. It was a song, a current of pure energy that hummed through her veins, waking up parts of her she thought were long dead. It was a feeling of coming home to a place she'd never been. The stranger's golden eyes widened, his lips parting on a silent gasp as he stared at her. No longer a man dying on her floor, but a destiny she had just stumbled into. Chapter 3. A Scar of Starlight. The air in the café crackled, thick with the scent of ozone and something ancient, something like fate. The shock of their connection still sang under Linda's skin, a terrifying, beautiful hum. The golden-eyed stranger stared at her, his delirium seeming to clear for just a second, replaced by a raw, desperate focus. He saw her, truly saw her, and it scared her more than the storm, more than the blood, more than the fact that a dying alpha wolf was lying on her floor, because that look promised to tear down all the walls she had so carefully built. He tried to speak, his voice a rough, broken whisper. I need her. His gaze flickered, losing its focus as the silver poison waged war inside him. Her blood, he rasped, his eyes sliding shut. To save my mate. The words hit Linda like a physical blow, a slap of ice-cold water. His mate. Of course. The cold, familiar ache of being used settled back into her bones. He didn't see her. He saw a tool. A means to an end. Just like Michael had. The flicker of connection, that beautiful, terrifying hum, turned sour in her chest. He was just another wolf who wanted to take something from her. Rage, cold and sharp, propelled her backward. She stumbled away from him, her heart a block of ice. No, she whispered to the empty cafe. I'm not doing this again. She wouldn't be a convenient solution to some alpha's problem. She wouldn't let her magic, her lifeblood be used to save the woman he loved. Let him die. The thought was ugly, but it felt like survival. She turned her back on him, her hands shaking. But then she heard him move, a desperate scramble on the floorboards. Before she could react, he was there. He wasn't moving with malice or anger, but with the last, desperate burst of a dying animal. He lunged, his large body colliding with hers, pinning her against the counter. His strength was fading, but it was still immense. The scent of him, pine and rain and wolf, enveloped her, and her mind went blank with panic. His head dipped to her neck, his breath hot against her skin. "Please," he breathed, the word a prayer of pure agony. And then she felt the prick of his fangs. It wasn't a bite. Not a full claim that would have shattered her soul and bound her to him forever. It was a graze, a desperate, fumbling attempt, but it was enough to break the skin. A scream tore from her throat as a pain unlike any other exploded from the point of contact. It was white-hot and blinding, a supernova igniting under her skin. It wasn't just pain, it was power. A raw, untamed magic burst forth from the wound, a torrent of silver light that lit up the dark café. Kael collapsed, the last of his strength gone, sliding to the floor in a heap. Linda staggered back, her hand flying to her neck, her whole body trembling violently. The pain was already receding, replaced by a strange, tingling warmth. When she pulled her fingers away, they were shaking. She looked down at her skin in the dim light. There, just above her collarbone, was a mark. It wasn't complete, but it was there, a swirl of intricate lines glowing with a faint, silvery light, like a constellation being born on her skin. And deep inside her, in the quiet, empty place where her wolf had slept for years, something stirred. A low, rumbling growl echoed in the depths of her soul. The dormant beast, the part of her she had locked away and sworn to forget, was waking up. Chapter 4. A Bond of Lies. The storm outside had cried itself to sleep. All that remained was a gentle, rhythmic dripping from the eaves of the café roof. Dawn was a promise on the horizon, a soft gray light that crept through the large window, painting the chaos inside with muted colors. Linda paced the worn wooden floor, a caged animal in her own sanctuary. Her hand was pressed to her neck, where the skin still tingled with a strange electrical warmth. It wasn't just a feeling on the surface, it was deeper. A thrumming, a pull, a humming wire that connected her to the large man still unconscious on her floor. And inside her, a presence. A low, rumbling awareness that hadn't been there yesterday. Her wolf was awake. After all these years of forced silence, it stretched and paced the confines of her soul, sniffing the air, aware of the other wolf in the room. A low groan broke the quiet. Linda's head snapped toward the sound. The man, the alpha, was stirring. He pushed himself up slowly, his movements stiff. The dark, ugly wounds from the silver had closed, the skin around them no longer black with poison, but a raw, angry red. The magical backlash from the marking, from her blood, had saved him. He rolled his head on his thick neck, and then his eyes found hers. The delirium was gone. The desperation was gone. All that was left in those molten gold eyes was a guilt so heavy it seemed to have a physical weight. He looked at her, and for the first time she felt like he was seeing a person, not a solution. And that was somehow worse. "My name is Kael," he said, his voice a low rumble that vibrated through the floorboards. "Alpha of the Northern Moonpack." He didn't get up. He just sat there, amidst the wreckage of her quiet life. "I didn't come here to do that." He gestured vaguely to the glowing mark on her neck. "I came here because I was desperate, and I've made everything so much worse." Linda hugged herself, a cold knot of dread tightening in her stomach. "What do you want from me?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. He looked away, unable to meet her gaze. "My mate. Her name is Liora. She's dying. A curse from a rival pack. It's been eating away at her for months. Nothing our healers do can stop it. He paused, taking a breath. There was a prophecy that the curse could only be broken by the blood of a daughter of the moon, a dormant wolf born of a witch's line. He finally looked at her, and the shame in his eyes was stark. I had my scouts searching for months. They found you. A healer who ran from her pack, who never shifted, whose mother was known to practice the old magic. You were the one. The pieces clicked into place, each one a shard of ice in her heart. He had hunted her. He had watched her. Her quiet, anonymous life had been a lie. "So you came here to take my blood?" she asked, the words tasting like acid. "Just a sample," he said, his voice pleading. "For a ritual. That's all it was supposed to be. But the hunters found me just outside of town. They hit me with silver. By the time I got to your door, I was dying. The poison, it makes the wolf frantic. All I could think about was the prophecy, about saving her." He finally stood up, a giant of a man full of regret. "When I touched you, my wolf, he goes by Drax. He felt something else. He didn't care about the ritual. He recognized you, and he acted. He tried to form a bond because he believed you were his." The words hung in the air, heavy and impossible. "The ritual went wrong. My wolf, he rejected Liora. He chose you instead." Linda let out a harsh, broken laugh. "Chose me?" she repeated, the sound brittle. "You ambushed me, you used me, and you marked me by mistake. That's not a choice, it's a catastrophe." She wanted to scream, to throw things, to claw that mark off her own skin. The pull she felt toward him wasn't fate. It was a mistake, an accidental chain wrapped around her neck. "Get out!" she seethed, pointing a trembling finger at the door. "Get out of my life." But as he took a step toward her, the mark on her skin pulsed with a sudden, undeniable heat, a silent argument against her own words. And just as he opened his mouth to reply, the sharp squeal of tires on the wet street outside sliced through the tension. A sound that promised a whole new kind of danger had just arrived. Chapter 5. Dawn and Danger. Kael's head snapped toward the window, the apology on his lips dying instantly. A low, dangerous growl rumbled deep in his chest, a sound that wasn't entirely human. His posture shifted, the heavy guilt replaced by the sharp, lethal focus of a predator. "They're here," he bit out. The words hung in the air, cold and sharp. A black SUV, sleek and menacing, had pulled up to the curb, its engine cutting out with a sinister silence. Linda's fear, which had been a cold knot in her stomach, exploded into ice water panic that shot through her veins. Who are they?" she whispered, her gaze locked on the vehicle. 4 men were getting out. They were large, dressed in dark, practical clothing, and they moved with a coordinated grace that screamed trained killer. They weren't cops. They weren't human. They radiated the same raw, wild energy as Kael, only theirs was twisted with something cruel. "Rivals," Kael said, moving to stand between her and the door. "The Blackstone Pack. They're the ones who cursed Liora. They must have been tracking me." His scent filled the air, no longer just pine and rain, but something sharper, more aggressive, the scent of an alpha preparing for war. A heavy fist pounded on the door, making the glass in the window rattle. "Thorn!" a voice bellowed from outside. It was rough, like gravel grinding together. "We know you're in there. We smelled the witch's magic pop the second you marked her." Marked her. The word made her flinch. It sounded so permanent, so possessive. "The prophecy belongs to us now. Send the girl out. An alpha's mark is a powerful thing. It belongs to a new master now." Linda felt like she was going to be sick. Her life, her small, quiet, carefully constructed life, was gone. It had been shattered the moment Kael fell on her doorstep. Now she was just a thing. A prize. a prophecy to be claimed by whoever won the fight. She was trapped between the man who had accidentally bound himself to her and the monsters outside who wanted to tear that bond away and claim her for themselves. There was no escape. This was the world she had run from, and it had come back to hunt her down with a vengeance. "Stay behind me," Kael ordered, his voice dropping into a command that brooked no argument. He wasn't looking at her, his golden eyes were fixed on the door, burning with a furious light. And then he began to change. It wasn't a full transformation into a wolf. It was something far more terrifying. A ripple went through his body, his shoulders broadening, his muscles coiling like thick ropes under his skin. His handsome face elongated, his teeth sharpening into fangs that gleamed in the dim morning light. Black, vicious claws burst from the tips of his fingers with a sound like tearing cartilage. He wasn't human anymore. He wasn't quite a wolf. He was a living weapon, a perfect fusion of man and monster, built for one purpose: to kill. With a roar that was pure, unrestrained fury, Kael ripped the door from its hinges and launched himself into the gray morning. Linda could only watch. A scream caught in her throat, her mind struggling to process the savage beauty of the violence. Kael moved like a blur of dark fury. He met the first wolf with a clawed hand that tore through flesh and bone. The second tried to flank him, but Kael was faster, his movements impossibly fluid. He spun, his body a whirlwind of controlled chaos, and threw the man through the window of the SUV. The fight was over in seconds. It was brutal, primal, and it was all for her. The two remaining wolves scrambled back into their vehicle and sped away, leaving their fallen comrades behind. Kael stood in the wreckage of her doorway, his chest heaving. Blood, not his own, dripped from his claws onto the pavement. He slowly began to shift back, his features softening, the claws receding, but the golden blaze in his eyes remained. He turned to her, his expression grim, his body still thrumming with violent energy. "That was a scouting party," he said, his voice a guttural mix of human and beast. "They'll be back, with their alpha, and an army." He took a step toward her, a predator cornering his prey. "You have a choice," he snarled, the words a harsh reality she couldn't escape. "You can stay here and wait for them to come back and claim you, or you can come with me, now." Chapter 6. Flight Through the Pines. The choice Kael offered wasn't a choice at all. It was one death sentence versus the slimmest chance of survival. Stay here, in the ruins of her life, and be taken by those animals? Or run with the man who was the cause of all this, the alpha who had accidentally tied her fate to his? Her quiet café, once a sanctuary, now felt like a beautifully decorated coffin. The smell of coffee was tainted with the stench of blood and violence. There was nothing left for her here. "Okay," she breathed, the word a puff of white in the cold morning air. Her body moved on autopilot. She ran behind the counter, grabbing the small, worn leather bag she always kept packed. An escape bag. She never knew what she was running from, but some broken part of her always knew she might have to run again. Keys, wallet, a change of clothes, a small hidden pouch of dried herbs. It was all she had left of her life. They didn't waste time. Kael led them out the back door, into a narrow, wet alley that smelled of salt and decay. The pre-dawn air was cold and sharp, and it bit at Linda's exposed skin. They moved quickly, their footsteps echoing softly on the cobblestones. They didn't look back. Looking back was a luxury she couldn't afford. The charming coastal town she had called home for 3 years shrank behind them, its quiet streets and quaint storefronts dissolving into the morning mist. With every step she was leaving Linda Ravenhart, the quiet cafe owner, behind. She didn't know who she was becoming, but she knew she was running toward the one thing she had sworn she would never face again: the wild. They reached the edge of town and plunged into the dense, rain-soaked pine forest that bordered it. The world became a labyrinth of massive tree trunks and dripping green ferns. The air grew heavy with the scent of damp earth and pine needles. They ran in silence, the only sound the squelch of their boots on the muddy ground and their own ragged breaths. Kael was a force of nature, moving through the undergrowth with an ease that belied his size. He was clearly in pain, his earlier fight having taken its toll, but he never slowed. He just pushed forward, his focus absolute. After what felt like an eternity, he stumbled, catching himself against a large, moss-covered boulder. He let out a pained grunt, one hand going to his side where a fresh wound was bleeding sluggishly. Without thinking, Linda was there. Her instincts, the healer's instincts she had suppressed for so long, took over. She placed her hand over his, ignoring the jolt of energy that flared between them. She closed her eyes and called on the small, fragile kernel of magic she still possessed. A soft, green light bloomed from her palm, seeping through their joined hands and into his wound. She felt the muscle underneath her touch slowly begin to knit together. It wasn't a full healing. Her power was too weak, too out of practice, but it was something. Kael stared at her hand, then at her face, his golden eyes wide with a mixture of shock and something else, something softer. Awe. The moment was broken by a long, mournful howl that echoed through the trees behind them. They were being hunted. The chase was on. Panic spurred them onward, their run becoming a frantic, desperate flight. They scrambled up hills, slid down ravines, the forest a blur of green and brown around them. The howls grew closer. They were being herded. Finally, just as Linda felt her lungs would burst, they broke through the trees onto a high, rocky ridge. The world opened up before them. A vast, misty valley stretched out below, cradled by mountains. In the center, smoke curled lazily into the morning sky from the chimneys of a large, sprawling settlement built of timber and stone. "My pack's border," Kael panted, his voice tight. "The territory of the northern moon." It didn't look like a home. It looked like a prison. As they started the long descent, they passed a small, secluded cabin nestled in a grove of birch trees. A light glowed in the window. Linda glanced inside as they passed, and her heart stopped. A beautiful woman with hair like spun moonlight lay pale and still in a large bed. At her side sat an older, gray-haired man, his hand resting on hers, his expression one of profound sadness. Kael stopped, his gaze fixed on the window, his face crumbling into a mask of such raw grief it stole Linda's breath. "Liora," he whispered, the name a wound. Linda's eyes darted from the dying woman in the cabin to the glowing, half-formed mark on her own neck. The terrible, impossible truth of her situation crashed down on her with the force of a tidal wave. She was the cure for the dying mate of the man who had just accidentally bound his soul to hers. Chapter 7. The Scent of Scorn. Kael led her into the heart of his pack. The settlement wasn't a collection of huts. It was a fortress of thick timber and dark stone, built to withstand a siege. A great hall stood in the center, smoke pluming from its chimney, smelling of roasting meat and burning pine. The sounds of life were everywhere, the ring of a blacksmith's hammer, the laughter of children, the low murmur of conversation. But the moment Kael and Linda stepped out of the tree line and into the main square, all of it stopped. The laughter died. The hammer fell silent. Every head turned. Every single pair of eyes, sharp, predatory, and unwelcoming, fixed on her. They weren't just looking at her face. Their gazes were drawn like magnets to the pale silvery mark that pulsed faintly on her neck. Consequently, the air, which had been alive and vibrant, grew thick with a sudden, suffocating hostility. Whispers started, a venomous hiss that slithered through the crowd. The witch. What has he brought back? An omen. Linda's first instinct was to shrink, to pull her jacket collar up and hide the mark, to make herself small and invisible. But she couldn't. She was standing next to their alpha, and every wolf in the settlement was watching her every move. She felt like a lone deer that had wandered into a den of hungry lions. Her dream of a quiet life was a distant memory. This new reality was a nightmare where she was the main attraction. A path cleared for them, the pack members parting as if she were carrying a disease. A large, grizzled wolf of a man with a scarred face and a single piercing eye stepped forward to block their path. He radiated authority, second only to Kael. "Gunner," Kael acknowledged, his voice tight. Gunner's good eye flickered from Kyle's grim face to Linda, his lip curling in a silent snarl. "What have you done, Alpha?" he demanded, his voice a low growl of disbelief. "Our Luna lies dying, and you bring this stranger into our midst?" He took a step closer, his gaze dropping to her neck. "You marked an outsider?" The accusation was a physical blow, and the crowd murmured in agreement. Ignoring him, Kael pushed forward, his hand gripping Linda's arm, pulling her along. His touch was a brand, a claim she didn't want. He led her away from the great hall, away from the prying eyes toward the secluded birch grove where she had seen the cabin. Inside, the air was heavy with the scent of sickness and old magic. The beautiful, moon-haired woman, Liora, lay in the bed, looking even more fragile up close. An old woman with kind, wrinkled eyes and long gray braids sat beside her, humming a soft, sad tune. Leora's pale blue eyes fluttered open. They found Linda's, and a flicker of understanding, not hatred, but a deep, heartbreaking sadness, passed through them. "You're not supposed to be here," she whispered, her voice as thin as a cobweb. It wasn't an accusation. It was a statement of fact, a lament for a destiny that had been broken. The old healer Alara approached them. "The prophecy," she said, her eyes fixed on Linda. "Let us see." She held out a small obsidian bowl containing a smooth, milky white stone. "A drop of your blood." Linda flinched, but Kael gave her a slight nod. With a silver pin, Alara pricked Linda's finger. A single crimson drop fell onto the moonstone. It didn't just glow, it sizzled. The stone hissed as if touched by a hot iron, and a plume of faint purple smoke curled into the air, smelling of lavender and ozone. Alara gasped, stumbling back. "By the great moon," she breathed, her eyes wide with fear and awe. "Her blood sings two songs. She is of two worlds, witch and wolf." The confirmation of the prophecy hung in the air, but it wasn't a relief. It was a curse because it deepened the pack's fear of her, the unknown quantity who had just fallen into their lives. Kyle's grip on her arm tightened, his knuckles white. He looked from the smoking stone to her, his expression shaken. "We need to understand what this mark is," he said, his voice a low, urgent current that pulled her from the cabin and into the encroaching twilight. Chapter 8. The Moon's Judgment. Kael pulled her through the darkening forest, his long strides forcing her into a near run to keep up. He didn't speak. The silence was heavy, filled with the unspoken questions that lay between them. He led her to a place that felt ancient and sacred. A wide, circular clearing carpeted with soft moss and surrounded by a ring of massive, gray standing stones. They looked like the teeth of some long-dead god, each one covered in faint, swirling carvings that seemed to shift in the dim light. The air here was different, still and quiet, humming with a low, latent power that made the hairs on Linda's arms stand up. The full moon was rising above the trees, a perfect, luminous pearl in the indigo sky. It bathed the clearing in a soft, ethereal light, making the shadows of the stones stretch long and black like grasping fingers. "This is a place of judgment," Kael said, finally letting go of her arm. His voice was low, reverent. "The moon sees all truth here." He gestured to the glowing mark on her neck. "A true mate bond. A fated bond. It settles under the full moon. It becomes permanent. A part of the soul." He looked at her, his golden eyes filled with a desperate conflict. If this was just a mistake, a magical accident caused by the silver and the prophecy, the moon may reject it. It might fade. He was offering a sliver of hope, a chance that this nightmare could be undone. But Linda knew, deep down, it wasn't that simple, because the pull she felt toward him was anything but a mistake. As the pure, white moonlight washed over them, the mark on her neck answered. It didn't fade. It blazed. A brilliant silver light erupted from her skin, so bright it made her gasp. It wasn't hot, but it was intensely alive, a network of starlight etched into her flesh. A guttural roar of sound tore from Kael's chest, and he staggered back, clutching his head. It was a sound of pure agony. "Drax," he groaned, his body trembling. She realized with a jolt of terror that he was fighting himself. His wolf, Drax, was surging forward, trying to take control. She could almost hear the battle raging inside him, a war between the man and the beast. The wolf's voice seemed to echo in the air around them, a possessive, primal snarl. "Mine." "No," Kael grunted, his knuckles white as he fought for control. "Liora. It has to be for Liora." "Mine," the wolf insisted, a more powerful, certain claim. "Our mate. Claim her. Now." Linda could only watch, her heart pounding. She should have been terrified, and she was. But she also felt a strange, aching sympathy for him, for the war he was fighting, and worse, her own wolf was reacting. It wasn't fighting. It was purring, a low, contented rumble in her soul. It recognized the alpha. It recognized the mate. It wanted to yield, to step into his arms, to feel the bond snap fully into place. The desire was a treacherous warmth spreading through her limbs, pulling her toward him even as her mind screamed to run away. The battle was too much. Kael lost. With a final, agonized groan, he surrendered. He surged forward, crossing the space between them in a single, fluid stride. His movements were no longer humanly hesitant. They were pure, predatory grace. He didn't touch her, not yet. He simply stood before her, his head lowered, his golden eyes blazing up at her from under his dark brow. The man was gone. This was the wolf. This was Drax. He lifted his hands, his fingers shaking with restraint, and framed her face. His touch was electric, a jolt that went straight to her core. The scent of him, pine, storm, and pure, undiluted alpha was intoxicating. The world narrowed to the breathless space between them. His head lowered slowly, his gaze locked on her lips. This was it, the completion of the bond. And a treacherous part of her wanted it more than her next breath. But just as his lips brushed against hers, a single, high-pitched scream of pure agony echoed from the valley below, shattering the moonlit spell and dousing the fire between them in the iciest guilt imaginable. Chapter 9. A Healer's Burden. Liora's scream ripped through the sacred clearing, a sound so full of pain it felt like a physical blade twisting in Linda's gut. The wolf in Kael's eyes vanished, replaced instantly by the man, his expression shattering into one of horror and self-loathing. He recoiled from Linda as if he'd been burned, stumbling backward with a choked gasp. The magnetic pull between them snapped, leaving a cold, empty void. Without a word, he turned and sprinted back toward the settlement, a man running from his own guilt. Linda followed, her legs feeling like lead, the ghost of his touch still burning on her skin. She felt like a trespasser, a homewrecker, the villain in a tragedy she never wanted to be a part of. They burst into the cabin to a scene of pure chaos. Liora was convulsing on the bed, her delicate body thrashing against the sheets. The air was thick with the foul stench of dark magic, and shadowy black tendrils like wisps of living smoke were wrapping around her limbs, tightening their grip. The healer, Ilara, was chanting frantically, her hands held over Liora, but her own magic, a faint silver light, was flickering and failing against the overwhelming darkness. Liora was dying. The curse was taking her, right now, in front of them all. Kael froze in the doorway, a statue carved from grief. He was utterly helpless, his alpha strength useless against this magical poison. He could fight armies, but he couldn't fight this. Seeing his despair, something inside Linda broke. All the anger, all the fear, all the resentment she felt toward him dissolved, replaced by a wave of fierce, undeniable empathy. This was the woman he loved, and she was watching him watch her die. Before her own mind could stop her, her body moved. The healer in her, the part of her she had tried to kill, took over completely. She pushed past Kael, her focus narrowing to the dying woman on the bed. "Let me," she said to Liora, her voice calm and steady in a way that surprised even herself. She didn't wait for permission. She placed her hands on Liora's sweat-dampened forehead. The moment she made contact, her own magic roared to life. It wasn't the gentle green light from the forest. It was a torrent, an unrestrained flood of silver and purple energy. The power of her witch mother and her wolf father, finally united and unleashed by the Alpha's mark, poured from her hands. She wasn't just soothing the symptoms. She was attacking the curse itself. The shadowy tendrils hissed, recoiling from her touch as if struck by lightning. She pushed her power forward, a silent declaration of war against the darkness. She felt the curse fight back, a cold, malevolent intelligence that tried to seep into her, to poison her as well. But her magic, wild and newly awakened, was stronger. With a final, desperate push, she forced the darkness away from Liora's heart. The shadowy smoke dissolved into nothingness. Liora's convulsions ceased, and with a soft, shuddering sigh, she fell into a deep, peaceful sleep. Her breathing was even, her color already returning. The effort, however, was immense. The power left her in a dizzying rush, leaving her feeling hollowed out, as if she had poured a piece of her own soul into Liora to save her. The world tilted, the edges of her vision going dark. Her knees buckled, and she collapsed, only to be caught in Kael's strong arms just before she hit the floor. He held her against his chest, his heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ear. Over his shoulder, she saw Liora staring at her, the old healer's eyes wide with a new, terrifying understanding. Liora began to whisper, her voice trembling as she recited a half-forgotten verse from the prophecy. "Two souls bound to the Alpha's heart," she breathed, her gaze flickering between the sleeping Liora and Linda. "One of moonlight, one of twilight's art. The second bond will pay the price to grant the first a final sunrise." The meaning was suddenly horribly clear. The second bond wasn't a treaty. It was a person. It was her. The pack members who had crowded into the doorway looked at her now with a chilling new emotion. The scorn was gone, replaced by a strange, terrible mix of fear and reverence. She wasn't just a witch. She wasn't just a cure. She was a prophesied sacrifice. Kael held her tighter, his expression a mask she couldn't read. He looked from his peacefully sleeping mate to the exhausted woman in his arms, the woman his wolf had chosen. He lowered his head, his voice a fierce, desperate oath whispered for her ears alone. "I will protect you." But as Linda looked up into his tormented golden eyes, she saw the truth. He was a man trapped in an impossible cage, caught between his unwavering duty to the woman he'd always loved and the undeniable destiny of the woman his soul had just claimed. She knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that he would be forced to choose one, and in doing so, he would utterly destroy the other. Chapter 10. Journey to the Sunstone Spire. Several days passed in a strange, tense limbo. Liora was stable, her sleep peaceful, but the dark magic of the curse still clung to her like a shroud. Linda's powerful intervention had been a reprieve, not a cure. It was Liora, the old healer, who finally gave their desperation a name and a destination. She explained that Linda's magic, a unique fusion of witch and wolf, needed a conduit, something to focus its power to shatter the curse for good. The legends spoke of a catalyst, a heartstone born from a fallen star that pulsed with the pure light of the moon. They could find one, she said, at a place called the Sunstone Spire, a jagged peak of obsidian that stabbed at the sky, located deep in the heart of the Blackstone Pack's territory. The declaration fell like a death sentence in the quiet cabin. It was a suicide mission. But Kael, his face set like granite, did not hesitate for a second. "I will go," he stated, his voice leaving no room for argument. And because Linda's magic was the key to the entire endeavor, she had to go with him. There was no choice. Her fate was once again decided for her, not by a mark, but by a map that led straight into the enemy's jaws. They left that night, two shadows slipping out of the northern moon settlement under the cold, watchful eyes of the stars, leaving a world of suspicion behind them for a world of certain danger ahead. Their journey was a whisper in the dark. They traveled only at night, the moon their only guide, navigating treacherous forests and silent, misty moors that belonged to their enemies. The forced proximity was a tangible thing, a constant pressure. During the day, they would find shelter in hidden caves or dense thickets, the space always too small, their bodies always too close. The air between them was thick with everything they refused to speak about. The glowing mark, the dying woman, the war he was fighting with his own wolf. So they talked about nothing, which somehow became everything. In the quiet moments, huddled for warmth, he would ask about her café, about the different kinds of coffee she served, about the funny old man who came in every morning for a scone. He listened with an intensity that made her feel, for the first time, like she wasn't just a prophecy or a problem to be solved. And she, in turn, asked about him. Not the alpha, but the man. She learned he loved the silence of the high mountains, that his father had taught him how to track by the stars, and that he carried a deep, profound loneliness that mirrored her own. They built a fragile bridge of words over the chasm of their impossible situation, and for a little while, it was almost enough to make her forget why they were there. One night, as a cold wind howled outside the shallow cave where they'd taken shelter, he finally showed her a piece of his broken heart. "I'm not afraid of the Blackstone wolves," he murmured, his gaze lost in the flickering flames of their tiny, smokeless fire. "I'm afraid of failing her. Liora. She was the first person who ever saw me as just Kael. Not an alpha's son. Not a future leader. Just a boy who was too serious for his own good." His vulnerability was a crack in his armor, a glimpse of the man beneath the crown of duty. And so, Linda offered him a piece of her own shattered past in return. "I once trusted someone like that," she said softly, her voice barely a whisper. "He was my fiancé. He told me my magic was a gift. Then he used that gift to secure a higher rank in his pack, leaving me behind when I was no longer useful." She didn't say Michael's name. She didn't have to. The pain was a universal language. Kael looked at her, and in his golden eyes, she saw not pity, but a deep, resonant understanding. He saw her. They were getting closer to the spire. The air grew thinner, colder. The next evening, while scouting a ridge, they heard the guttural laughter of a Blackstone patrol below. Kael pulled her into a narrow crevice between two massive rocks, pressing her back against the cold stone and shielding her with his body. The space was so tight she could barely breathe. His chest was a wall of solid muscle against her back, his scent, pine and winter air, filling her senses. She could feel the steady, powerful beat of his heart. The patrol passed, their voices fading into the distance, but he didn't move. He was completely still, his body rigid with a tension that had nothing to do with the enemy. Thinking she was asleep or perhaps just lost in his own private hell, he let out a shuddering breath, his voice a raw, tormented whisper meant only for the uncaring stone. "She's just a means to an end. It has to be for Liora." The words, so quiet and so final, struck Linda with the force of a physical blow, and the fragile, tentative bridge they had built between their two lonely souls crumbled into dust. Chapter 11. The Price of Truth. The rest of the journey was a silent agony. Kael's whispered words played over and over in Linda's mind, a cruel mantra of her own foolishness. A means to an end. The warmth that had begun to sprout in her chest toward him withered and died, replaced by the familiar cold shield of betrayal. He had been so convincing. His vulnerability had felt so real. She had let herself believe, just for a moment, that the connection between them was more than a magical accident, more than a consequence of his desperation. She had been a fool. Her walls, the ones she had spent years building, went back up, reinforced with the cold, hard certainty that she could never, ever trust a wolf again. She became a ghost. She walked where he walked, ate when he offered food, and slept when he took watch. But she did it all with a distant, chilling silence. Kael felt the shift immediately. The fragile warmth between them had been replaced by a polar frost. He tried to breach it, his golden eyes filled with a confused hurt. "Linda? What's wrong?" he asked, his voice low and concerned as they made camp at the base of the towering obsidian spire. His feigned innocence was the final straw. She spun on him, her eyes blazing with a cold, quiet fury. "What's wrong?" she repeated, her voice dangerously soft. "I finally understood the rules of the game, that's all." She touched the mark on her neck, the skin beneath it feeling tainted. "You told me this was an accident, that your wolf acted on instinct. But that was a lie, wasn't it? At least, part of it was. You were looking for a daughter of the moon long before you ever stumbled into my café. You knew who I was. You came for me." Kael flinched as if she had struck him. He had the decency to look ashamed. "Linda, it's more complicated than that." "No, it isn't," she shot back, her voice rising. "It's simple. You needed a cure, you found one, and you were going to take it. Tell me I'm wrong." He couldn't. The truth was written all over his face. He finally broke, the words spilling out of him in a torrent of guilt and desperation. "Yes," he admitted, his voice raw. "Yes, my scouts found you. Yes, I came to your town specifically for you. I was going to beg, to bargain, to force you to help if I had to. I would have done anything to save Liora. I was a desperate man." He took a step toward her, his hands open in a plea. "But you have to believe me. The rest, that was never the plan. I came expecting to find an ingredient, a solution to a problem. I never, ever expected to find you." He struggled with the word, his gaze intense. "I didn't expect the way my wolf would react, the way it would recognize you. That part was never a lie. I swear it." His confession was meant to show her his inner conflict, to make her understand. But all Linda heard was a confirmation of her deepest, most painful wound. She was a target. The entire foundation of their encounter was built on his calculated desperation. The accidental marking, his wolf's supposed choice, none of it mattered, because the initial intent was to use her. The shared moments by the fire, the quiet conversations, the look in his eyes that she'd mistaken for budding affection, it was all tainted. She felt a wave of humiliation wash over her. "So, I was just a complication in your perfect plan," she said, her voice flat and empty. Their heated argument, a raw explosion of truth and pain, had made them careless. A twig snapped in the darkness behind them. They spun around, but it was too late. Wolves erupted from the shadows, sleek and silent predators. The Blackstone Patrol. At their head was a large, vicious-looking wolf with a cruel scar that split his lip into a permanent sneer. He lunged, not for Linda, but for Kael. The fight was a blur of claws and fangs. Kael fought with the fury of a cornered alpha, but he was outnumbered. The scarred wolf, Marcus, drove a wicked-looking blade, its edge shimmering with the telltale gleam of silver deep into Kael's leg. Kael roared in agony and collapsed to one knee. Marcus grinned, turning his cold, triumphant eyes on Linda. "The Alpha King will be very pleased," he snarled, advancing on her. "He's been waiting a long time to get his hands on his little prophecy." Chapter 12. Written in starlight. The title, Alpha King, hung in the air, a terrifying new piece in a puzzle Linda didn't understand. But there was no time to process it. Kael was on the ground, his face pale with pain, the silver-laced blade still buried in his thigh. Marcus, the scarred Blackstone wolf, was advancing on her, his intentions brutally clear in his hungry eyes. A primal fear, cold and sharp, seized her. She was defenseless. She was next. But then she looked at Kael, struggling to rise, his gaze fixed on her with a desperate, protective fire. And something inside her shifted. The fear was still there, but it was overwhelmed by a sudden volcanic surge of pure, unadulterated rage. He was her alpha. The thought came unbidden, a whisper from the wolf inside her, and it changed everything. Marcus lunged, his claws extended. "You're mine now, witch," he growled. Linda didn't run. She didn't scream. She threw up her hands, a purely instinctual act of defiance. A shield of shimmering violet energy erupted from her palms, slamming into Marcus with the force of a battering ram and throwing him backward into a tree. The raw power of it shocked everyone, Linda most of all. The air around the sunstone spire hummed, the obsidian peak acting like a massive amplifier for her magic, drawing it out of her in powerful, uncontrolled waves. The other wolves hesitated for a moment, stunned before attacking as a pack. The next few minutes were a chaotic ballet of desperation. Linda was a whirlwind of instinct. She threw up barriers of crackling energy. She sent waves of force that knocked wolves off their feet. She even managed to wrap a vine of pure magic around one's ankle, sending him sprawling. But she wasn't a warrior. They were relentless, and with every pulse of magic she unleashed, she felt her own life force draining away. She could see Kael trying to pull the silvered blade from his leg, his movements sluggish from the poison. They weren't going to win. They were going to die here, at the foot of this dark, humming mountain. There was only one option left, a terrible, desperate gamble. With a cry, Linda turned her palms toward Kael and unleashed everything she had left. It wasn't a shield or a weapon. It was a pure, undiluted torrent of healing energy, a river of silver and purple light that flowed from her soul directly into his wounded body. The silver blade in his leg sizzled and dissolved into black smoke. The flesh beneath knitted together at a visible rate. It was a massive, staggering act of sacrifice, and it cost her everything. The world dissolved into a gray, swimming haze. Her strength vanished. She fell to her knees, completely defenseless, her body an empty, echoing shell. At that exact moment, as she collapsed, a shadow fell over the land. The moon, which had been a bright silver coin, began to change. A dark disk slid across its face, and the light that washed over the spire shifted from silver to a deep, ominous crimson. A blood moon. The eclipse was here. The crimson moonlight poured down, and when it touched the pale, half-formed mark on Linda's neck, the world seemed to hold its breath. It didn't just glow, it ignited. The silvery lines bled into a brilliant, fiery red. They connected, swirled, and solidified into a complex, beautiful, and undeniably complete alpha-mate bond, blazing on her skin like a brand of fate. A wave of pure, irrefutable truth washed through her, and she felt it slam into Kael as well. A gasp escaped his lips. This was no accident. This was no mistake. This was destiny, written in starlight and now sealed in blood. From deep within Kael, his wolf, Drax, let out a silent howl of pure triumph that echoed not in the clearing, but directly in her soul, a single possessive word that changed everything forever. Mate. But as they reeled from the celestial revelation, a new sound cut through the night. It was a scream, carried on the wind from the distant valley of the northern moon. It wasn't a cry of pain or fear. It was a shriek of pure, unadulterated fury. It was Liora. Back in her bed, she had awakened, feeling the final, irrevocable snap of the bond between Kael and Linda solidifying across the miles. And she screamed to the heavens, her voice a prophecy of its own. "You have doomed us all." Chapter 13. A Kingdom of Two. The world came crashing back in a symphony of violence. The crimson light of the blood moon still stained the clearing, painting the scene in shades of blood and shadow. The remaining Blackstone wolves, who had been momentarily stunned by the celestial display, snarled and regrouped, but the man they faced was not the same one they had ambushed moments before. Kael was on his feet, the silver wound on his leg completely gone, his body thrumming with a power that was terrifying to behold. The completed bond with Linda didn't just heal him, it had ignited him. He was no longer just an alpha fighting for a cause. He was a mate defending the other half of his soul, and the raw, primal power of it radiated from him in scorching waves. The fight was no longer a fight. It was a reckoning. Kael moved with a speed and brutality that was breathtaking. He was a whirlwind of black leather and righteous fury, his claws tearing through his enemies, his golden eyes blazing with the light of the crimson moon. He fought for the woman who had saved him, for the bond that now sang in his veins, for the terrible, beautiful truth that had just been revealed to them. He was not just fighting for a life, he was fighting for a destiny. The scarred wolf, Marcus, seeing the tide turn so irrevocably, gave a final, chilling threat. "The Alpha King knows!" he roared over the sounds of battle. "He will come for what is his!" Before melting back into the shadows, a coward's retreat. As the last of his enemies fell and silence descended upon the clearing, a new assault began. A silent one, inside Kael's mind. A frantic psychic message, sharp and jagged with panic, pierced his thoughts. It was Gunnar, his beta. "Kael, what is happening? The bond. We all felt it. It's complete." The mental voice was laced with horror and disbelief. A moment later, it was followed by the pack's collective will, a crushing wave of anger and betrayal fueled by Liora's distant, enraged scream. "The witch has cursed you. Her magic has twisted your mind. Abandon her. Now. Return to your Luna. It is your duty." The command was absolute. It was the voice of his people, his family, his entire life's purpose. It was the oath he had taken, the duty he had been born to uphold. He looked over at Linda. She was struggling to her feet, exhausted and pale, her body trembling from the magical backlash. The full, intricate mark blazed on her neck, a perfect crimson constellation that tied her to him forever. He looked at her, so fragile and yet so fierce, the woman who had faced down his enemies, the woman who had healed him with her own life force, the woman his very soul had screamed for. His internal war, the long, agonizing battle between his duty and his heart, was finally over. The choice was clear, and it was going to destroy him. He closed his eyes, shutting out the desperate pleas of his pack. He focused his will, gathering his thoughts into a single, quiet, and final declaration. He sent it back through the mind link, a message that would sever him from everything he had ever known. "She is my mate," he sent, the words a calm and unbreakable vow. "My duty is to her, now. I will not abandon her." He felt the collective gasp of his pack, the shock, the outrage. And then, one by one, he felt the mental connections he had shared with his people his entire life snap shut. The psychic link to Gunnar, to Ilara, to his entire pack. It went silent. He was an alpha with no pack, a king with no kingdom. He was utterly and completely alone, save for the woman standing before him. He opened his eyes and looked at Linda, the weight of his sacrifice settling upon him. They were exiles, hunted by one pack, rejected by their own. A kingdom of two against the entire world. He took a step toward her, his expression a mask of grim resolve. "They won't stop hunting you," he said, his voice rough. "The Alpha King, Corvus, he will never stop." But before he could say another word, a new voice, a different voice, slithered into his mind, and he knew Linda could hear it too. It was cold, ancient, and dripping with terrifying power. It was the voice of the Alpha King himself. "You have something of mine, Kael Thorne," the voice hissed across the miles. "And I have something of yours. I have your precious Liora, a life for a life. Bring me the girl." Chapter 14. A life for a life. The Alpha King's words hung in the cold mountain air, an invisible blade poised over their heads. "I have your precious Liora." The threat was as simple as it was devastating. Kael let out a choked sound, a mixture of a gasp and a snarl. He was a storm of raw, helpless fury. The image of Liora, pale, innocent, and now a hostage, flashed in his mind. He was torn in two, a man caught in an impossible vice. On one side was Linda, his new, fated mate, the woman who stood beside him, her presence a warm, steady anchor in the chaos. On the other was the ghost of his past, the woman he had sworn to protect, the woman whose life was now being held for ransom. His failure was a poison, and it was corroding him from the inside out. But as Linda watched the agony twist Kael's handsome features, a strange and profound calm settled over her. All her life, she had been a leaf in the wind, buffeted by the choices of others, her fiancé's ambition, her pack's scorn, Kael's desperation, this Alpha King's machinations. She had been running, hiding, reacting. She was done reacting. She looked at Kael, at this powerful alpha who had just sacrificed his entire world for her, and she saw him not as a captor, but as another soul trapped in this web. She thought of Liora, a woman she had never spoken to, who was guilty of nothing more than being loved by the same man fate had just bound to Linda. And in that moment, Linda knew she would not be the cause of one more person's suffering. "I'll do it," she said, her voice quiet but firm, cutting through Kael's turmoil. He stared at her, his golden eyes wide with confusion. "Do what?" "I'll go to him," she clarified, her gaze steady and unwavering. "I'll give myself up. He wants me, not her. A life for a life," he said. Kael's reaction was explosive. "No!" he roared, the sound echoing off the obsidian spire. "Absolutely not. I will not trade you. I will not lose you." He strode toward her, his large hands gripping her shoulders, his desperation a tangible force. "We'll find another way. We'll fight them. We'll—" "There is no other way," she interrupted, her voice rising to meet his. It was their first argument as mates, a passionate, desperate clash of two stubborn wills. "You can't fight an entire pack, Kael. Not his, not while running from your own. How many will have to die before he gets what he wants? How much more blood needs to be spilled? I don't care. Your safety is all that matters," he thundered, his grip tightening. It was in that moment that Linda's transformation was complete. The fearful, hesitant café owner was gone forever, replaced by a woman of terrifying, resolute power. She reached up and gently, but firmly, removed his hands from her shoulders. "You sacrificed your pack for me," she said, her voice softening, but losing none of its steel. "You gave up your home, your duty, everything you've ever known because you believed your place was with me. Now let me make my own choice." She looked him directly in the eye, and the strength he saw there made him fall silent. "This isn't your decision to make. This started because of a prophecy about my blood. It will end with me. I refuse to let an innocent woman die for a destiny I never asked for." She was no longer a victim of fate. She was taking control of it, wielding it like a weapon of her own making. Kael stood frozen, silenced by her conviction. He wanted to argue, to lock her away and face the world alone, but he saw the unshakable resolve in her eyes. She was his mate, and she was his equal. As he wrestled with this new reality, distracted by the war within his own heart, Linda closed her eyes. She reached out, not with her hands, but with her mind. It was a new, fragile sense, a filament of thought, a gift from her witch's lineage that had been unlocked and amplified by the completed mate bond. She focused on the cold, cruel voice of the Alpha King, and she sent a single, clear, and silent message across the miles. A message Kael could not hear. "I'll come. Alone. Tell me where. Just let her go." The reply was instantaneous, a cold, triumphant hiss that echoed only in her mind. "The old hunting grounds, north of the Black River, at midnight. Come alone, witch. Or your Alpha's precious moonlight bride dies screaming." She had made the bargain, and she had just signed her own death warrant. Chapter 15. The Midnight Ritual. Deceiving him was the hardest thing she had ever done. The new bond that pulsed between them was a conduit of truth, and every moment she spent planning her escape felt like a sharp, physical betrayal. As twilight bled across the sky, painting the mountains in hues of purple and orange, she turned to Kael with a carefully constructed calm. "I need to find some herbs," she said, her voice steady. "King's foil and shadow root, for the journey ahead. They grow in the darker parts of the forest." Kael's golden eyes narrowed with suspicion. He could feel her resolve, the strange, hard wall she had erected in her mind. He didn't want to let her out of his sight. But he also saw the fierce independence in her gaze, the silent plea to trust her. With a heavy, reluctant sigh, he nodded. "Be safe," he murmured, his voice thick with a dread he couldn't name. "Come back to me." "Always," she lied, the word a bitter stone in her throat. She gave him one last lingering look, memorizing the rugged lines of his face, before turning and disappearing into the encroaching shadows of the forest. The old hunting grounds were a place of death, a wide circular clearing where the trees were skeletal and black, their branches like twisted, grasping claws against the starry sky. A palpable aura of old bloodshed hung in the air, cold and stagnant. When Linda stepped into the clearing, she knew she had been a fool. The Blackstone wolves were there, their forms like shadows among the dead trees. The Alpha King, Marcus, stood in the center, a cruel, triumphant smirk on his scarred face. But Liora was nowhere to be seen. The cold, hard truth crashed down on her. It had all been a lie. "You didn't really think I'd bargain, did you?" Marcus sneered, his voice dripping with condescending amusement. "Liora is safe in her bed, sleeping off your little magical trick, but the threat of her was all it took to bring my little sister home." "Sister?" Linda breathed, the words stolen from her lungs by a wave of shocked disbelief. Marcus's smirk widened. "You don't remember me, do you, Lynn? But I remember you. I remember our mother's magic. I remember our father's weakness. He wanted to hide our power, to live in peace." He spat on the ground. "I wanted to rule." He stepped forward, his eyes glowing with a malevolent red light. This was Corvus, her estranged older brother, the one who had vanished years ago after a dark, violent argument with their parents. He was the one who had been hunting her, not for a prophecy, but for the power in her blood, power he believed was his by right. He was the one who had cursed Liora, not out of hatred, but as a calculated move to bring all the pieces of his twisted game together on this exact board. Before she could react, his wolves were on her. They dragged her struggling to the center of the clearing, where a flat, black stone altar stood, carved with dark, jagged runes. They bound her wrists and ankles with rough leather straps. Corvus began to chant, his voice a low, guttural drone. The runes on the altar began to glow with a sickly green light. The air grew impossibly cold, and shadows writhed and danced at the edge of the clearing. He produced a ritual dagger and sliced it across her palm, letting her blood drip onto the stone. "Your unique blood, sister," he hissed, his eyes wild with power. "The perfect fusion of wolf and witch. It will fuel a ritual that will make me a god." He was draining her, her very life force being siphoned away to feed his dark, hungry magic. Suddenly, a howl of pure, unadulterated rage tore through the night. Kael, he exploded into the clearing, a force of nature, a blur of claws and fury. He had felt her terror through the bond, had known instantly that she had deceived him. He fought with the desperation of a man who had already lost his world and was about to lose his soul. He tore through Corvus's wolves, a god of vengeance in his own right. But it was too late. Corvus laughed, a high, manic sound, and raised the dagger high. "It is finished!" he screamed, and plunged the blade of pure, condensed shadow deep into Linda's chest. The world went white, then silent. Kael froze mid-lunge, his eyes locked on her. The brilliant crimson mark on her neck, the symbol of their eternal bond, flickered once, twice, and then died, fading to a dull, ashen gray. He felt it in his soul. The bond, the living, breathing connection that had tied him to her, snapped. The line went silent. The light went out. A howl tore from his throat, a sound of such profound, soul-shattering agony that the very stars seemed to weep in the sky above. Chapter 16, A World of Ash. The bond did not fade. It did not unravel. It snapped. One moment, A universe of warmth, light, and connection existed inside Kael's soul, a vibrant crimson thread tying him to Linda. The next, a void. A silent, sudden, and absolute nothing. The world lost its color, its sound, its meaning. Corvus stood over Linda's still form on the stone altar, laughing. It was a high, manic sound. The sound of a madman who had just become a god, and it didn't even register. All Kael could see was the dull, ashen-gray mark on Linda's neck. A dead star. A cooled ember. A promise that had been brutally extinguished. His grief was a cold, heavy thing. It didn't burn. It froze. It turned his muscles to ice and his bones to lead. The rage that followed was just as cold, a silent, killing frost that had no need for a roar. He moved. He didn't remember deciding to, but he was suddenly flying across the clearing, a specter of vengeance aimed at the laughing man who had stolen his son from the sky. The fight was brutally short. Corvus, now crackling with the stolen, vibrant energy of Linda's life force, was impossibly powerful. He met Kael's attack with a casual, contemptuous flick of his wrist. A wave of black energy slammed into Kael, throwing him through the air like a broken doll. He crashed against the skeletal trunk of a dead tree and slid to the ground, his body broken. But his heart was what truly felt the pain. Corvus sauntered over, his eyes glowing with a triumphant, malevolent light. He didn't kill Kael. The thought was a mercy, and he was fresh out. "Live with it," Corvus sneered, his voice dripping with poison. "Live in the world you helped me create, knowing you lost the only thing that ever truly mattered. That is a fate so much sweeter than death." He then turned, and with his remaining followers, melted into the darkness, leaving Kael alone in a graveyard of his own making. Time ceased to exist. Kael eventually managed to crawl to the altar. He reached out a trembling hand and touched Linda's face. So cold. He traced the lines of the dead gray mark on her neck. My fault. The thought was a steady, rhythmic drumbeat of self-loathing in his silent soul. I should have seen the trap. I should have protected her. I let her go. He opened his mouth to howl, to scream his agony into the uncaring night, but no sound came out. The part of him that was connected to the wild, to the moon, to his mate. It was silent. He was utterly, devastatingly alone. Just as the crushing weight of his despair threatened to swallow him whole, a rustle in the trees broke the silence. Two figures emerged from the shadows. Gunnar, his beta, his face a mask of grim sorrow. And leaning on his arm, looking frail but very much alive, was Liora. Her eyes, no longer clouded by the curse, were clear and filled with a profound, heartbreaking pity. The moment the bond between him and Linda had snapped, the final vestiges of her own curse had shattered because its entire purpose had been fulfilled. She was free. But she didn't look free. She looked heartbroken. She knelt beside him, her hand hovering over Linda's still form. "Oh, Kael," she whispered, tears streaming down her pale cheeks. She was the one. She was always the one. Kael stared at her, uncomprehending. Liora shook her head, a sad, bitter smile touching her lips. We were never true mates. Not in the way the moon goddess intended. We were a perfect match, yes. We loved each other, yes. But the fated bond, the kind that sings between two halves of the same soul, it was never there for us. She confessed that she had always felt it, a small, quiet emptiness beside him that she could never name. It was that emptiness, that lack of a true, divine blessing, that had made her vulnerable to Corvus's curse in the first place. The dark magic needed a flaw, a crack in their union to take root. The curse was never about me, she cried softly. It was about her. It was all designed to bring you to her. The revelation was the final killing blow. His entire life, his every action, his profound sense of duty to Liora, all of it had been built on a beautiful, tragic lie. He had sacrificed the true half of his soul for a duty that was never really his. As this new, more profound agony washed over him, he leaned down, pressing his forehead to Linda's, a silent goodbye. and in the absolute, dead silence of his soul, he felt it, an impossible flicker, a faint, ghostly echo of warmth against the dead mark on his own skin. It was less than a whisper. It was the memory of a sound. And it was her. Chapter 17. The First Daughter. There was no pain, no fear. There was only quiet. Linda floated in a gentle, warm darkness, a peaceful void that cradled her like a womb. The agony of the shadow blade, the terror of her brother's betrayal, the crushing weight of her sacrifice. It was all gone. This was the end, then. It was peaceful. She could stay here forever, adrift in this silent velvet ocean and want for nothing. It was the release she had, in some ways, always craved. But then a light began to bloom in the distance. Not a harsh, blinding light, but a soft, gentle glow, like a candle being lit in a vast, dark room. The light grew, and within it, a figure took shape. It was a woman, regal and kind, with eyes that held all the wisdom of the stars and hair that flowed around her like spun moonlight. A profound sense of love and familiarity washed over Linda. It was a feeling she had only ever known in her deepest, most cherished memories. "Mother?" she whispered, the name a thought more than a sound. The spirit of her mother smiled. "You have been so brave, my daughter." Her voice wasn't spoken, it was felt, a warm current in the peaceful darkness. "But your journey is not over. Not unless you choose it to be." Linda was confused. "What is this place?" "This is the space between," her mother explained. "The threshold between the living world and the ancestral realm. You are here because your soul is not yet ready to let go, and because he is not ready to let you go." Her mother showed her things then, not in words, but in a flood of pure knowledge and memory that poured directly into Linda's soul. She saw her lineage, a long, unbroken line of powerful women stretching back through the mists of time. She learned they were not just any witch-wolf family. They were the direct descendants of the first daughter, the very first she-wolf to walk the earth, the one who had been loved by a forest spirit and blessed by the moon goddess herself. Their blood was a sacred trust, a vessel for the purest spark of the goddess's magic. This was the power Corvus had craved. He didn't just want to be an alpha king. He wanted to steal the divine magic of their lineage, to swallow the power of the goddess and become a dark god. Her mother then showed her Kael. She saw his ancient bloodline, a line of fierce, noble alphas tasked with protecting the balance of their world. She saw how their two bloodlines, hers and his, were like two sides of a coin, separated for centuries, and how they were prophesied to one day reunite. Their bond wasn't a simple fated match, it was a cosmic necessity, a weapon forged by destiny itself to combat a great darkness, a darkness that her brother now wore like a crown. "He needs you, my child," her mother's voice urged, gentle but firm. "The bond you share is more than a mark on the skin. It is a bridge between souls. Even in this place, a part of you is still connected to him. You can feel his pain," and Linda could. As she focused, she could feel a faint, distant pull, an echo of a soul-deep howl of grief. It was Kael. He was in agony. He was alone. The peace of the spirit realm was a beautiful, seductive song, promising an end to all struggle, an end to all pain. She could stay. She could let go and find her rest. The thought was tempting. So very tempting. But then she saw an image of the world Kael would be left in. A world ruled by her brother's cruelty. A world shrouded in shadow and fear. A world without her. The thought of his pain, of his loneliness, was an anchor. It was a reason. It was everything. She looked at her mother, the quiet peace of the void falling away, replaced by a new, burning resolve. She had spent her life as a victim, a pawn in other people's games. But now she knew who she was. She was not just a healer. She was not just a witch. She was a daughter of the moon, a direct heir to a power that could reshape the world. And the other half of her soul was lost in the darkness, preparing to die for her. The choice was not a choice at all. "I'm going back," she declared, and her voice, for the first time, held the undeniable power of a queen. Chapter 18. An Echo in the Void. Back in the world of the living, despair had a taste. It tasted like cold ash and stale air. Kael sat beside the funeral pyre they had built for Linda, the unlit wood a stark, grim monument to his failure. Liora and Gunnar had helped him carry her body from the defiled altar, their movements slow and somber. Liora had tried to speak to him, to offer words of comfort, her own face pale with a grief that was both for him and for the woman she had never known. But Kael was a stone. He was a hollowed-out mountain, unreachable, lost in a silent, gray landscape of unending regret. The vibrant, living world had been reduced to a colorless photograph of what it once was. Gunnar, ever the beta, had been scouting. He returned as the first hints of dawn threatened the eastern sky, his expression grim. "Corvus is on the move," he reported, his voice low. "He's not hiding. He's marching his forces toward our territory, the power he stole. Kael, it's immense. He radiates it like a plague. Our pack is in chaos, leaderless. They won't stand a chance." The implication was clear. Corvus was coming to wipe the northern moon from the face of the earth, and then he would move on to the next pack and the next until the entire world was kneeling at his feet. Kael listened, but the words barely registered. Victory was impossible. Survival was a fantasy. He knew, with a cold, dead certainty, that he could not defeat Corvus. No one could now, but he could still bleed him. He could still be a thorn in the monster's side. He could still offer up one final act of defiance. He looked at Gunnar, his golden eyes, once so full of fire, now dull and empty. "Take Liora," he commanded, his voice a dead, emotionless rasp. "Take what's left of the pack, the elders, the pups, and run. Go north to the frozen wastes. Hide, survive. That is your final order as my beta." "And you, Alpha?" Gunnar asked, though he already knew the answer. "I am going to buy you time," Kael stated simply. It wasn't a plan of battle. It was a suicide note. He would face Corvus alone. He would die, but he would die fighting, a final, meaningless act of penance for the woman he had failed to protect. It was the only thing left for him to do. It was his one, final act as an alpha. He would die as he had lived for so long, in service to a duty. Gunnar and Liora argued. They pleaded, but it was like talking to a cliff face. Kael was unmovable. With heavy hearts and tearful goodbyes, they finally left him, two retreating figures disappearing into the gloom, leaving him truly and utterly alone. He stood before the unlit pyre, the last man in a dead world. He had lost his pack. He had lost his purpose. He had lost the mate he had only just begun to understand. He reached out and gently touched the cold ashen mark on his own neck, a final, silent goodbye to the other half of his soul. This was the end. He turned his back on her body, ready to walk toward his own death. He was completely alone. The world was utterly silent. The bond was a dead, empty channel in his soul. He took a step. And then it happened. A single impossible flicker, a pinprick of warmth against the cold, dead brand on his neck. It was so faint he thought he had imagined it. A ghost of a connection, a memory of a feeling. He froze, his heart stopping in his chest. And then a single, clear word, not a sound, but a pure thought, echoed in the vast, desolate emptiness of his soul. It was a whisper that screamed louder than any battle cry. Kael. Chapter 19. Daughter of the Moon. Kael heard the whisper again, stronger this time, a silken thread of warmth pulling at the frayed edges of his soul. Kael. It wasn't his imagination. It wasn't the madness of his grief. It was her. He whipped around, his gaze locking onto the funeral pyre where Linda's body lay. His heart, which he thought had stopped beating, gave a single painful thud. A light was beginning to grow around her, a soft, silver luminescence that seemed to emanate from her very skin. It pushed back the grim gray light of the false dawn, bathing the clearing of dead trees in a gentle, hopeful glow. The ashen, lifeless mark on her neck began to pulse. Faintly at first, then with a steady, rhythmic beat, like a heart starting again. The gray bled away, replaced by a shimmering liquid silver that quickly deepened into a brilliant, molten gold. The light intensified, so pure and so powerful that Kael had to raise a hand to shield his eyes. A wave of raw, benevolent magic, the scent of moonlight and blooming nightshade and ancient, impossible power washed over the clearing. Where the light touched the dead, skeletal trees, a miracle occurred. Tiny silver leaves began to sprout from the blackened branches, unfurling in the celestial glow. Life was returning to a place of death. Then, with a soft gasp that seemed to draw in all the light in the clearing, Linda's eyes snapped open, but they were not the eyes he remembered. The warm human brown was gone, replaced by two luminous golden orbs. They were the exact color of his own, of his wolf's, but they held a different fire. Hers was not the fire of a terrestrial alpha. It was the ancient, knowing, and eternal light of the stars themselves. She sat up on the pyre, the tattered remains of her clothes falling away to reveal skin that was flawless, the mortal wound from the shadow blade gone without so much as a scar. She was no longer the tired café owner. She was no longer the frightened fugitive. She radiated a calm, unshakable power, an authority that was as natural as the rising of the moon. "Linda?" Kael breathed, his voice cracking, the name a prayer. He stumbled forward, his legs shaking, his mind struggling to comprehend the miracle before him. Was she a ghost? An angel? She turned her head and her new golden eyes found his. A smile so familiar it broke his heart and then pieced it back together again, spread across her face. "I told you I'd always come back to you," she said, and her voice was different too. It was still hers, but it was layered with a new resonance, a quiet power that hummed in the very air around them. He fell to his knees beside the pyre, reaching out a trembling hand to touch her cheek. She was real. She was warm. She was alive. All the grief, all the guilt, all the cold, empty despair that had consumed him vanished in an instant, burned away by the radiant sun of her return. Tears he didn't know he had left to cry streamed down his face as he buried his head in her lap, his body racked with shuddering, relieved sobs. She ran her fingers through his hair, her touch a benediction, a promise of a new dawn. She let him cry, her own heart aching with a love so fierce and so profound it was a physical presence. When his sobs finally subsided, he looked up at her, his face streaked with tears, his eyes full of a worshipful awe. She helped him to his feet, and as she stood, she was no longer a woman he was protecting. She was his equal, a queen standing beside her king. She turned her gaze toward the direction her brother had fled, her golden eyes narrowing with a purpose as hard and as bright as a diamond. "No alpha decides my fate but me," she declared, her voice ringing with a power that made the very stones around them vibrate. "And my brother will not have this world." Just as she spoke, two figures burst into the clearing, drawn by the impossible surge of power. It was Gunnar and Liora, their faces a mask of utter astonishment. They stopped dead, staring at the woman who had risen from the dead, bathed in the light of the moon, and they knew, with absolute certainty, that the prophecy was never about a sacrifice. It was about a rebirth. Chapter 20, An Alliance of Ash and Ember. The shock of Linda's return was a seismic event, sending tremors of disbelief and awe through the small, weary group. Liora looked at the woman before her, glowing, powerful, and undeniably alive, and let out a soft, relieved sob. Gunnar, ever the stoic warrior, simply stared, his one good eye wide with a reverence usually reserved for the moon goddess herself. The questions could wait. Survival could not. As the celestial light around Linda softened into a gentle, personal aura, Gunnar's grim report about Corvus's movements brought them all crashing back to the brutal reality of their situation. "He's not just marching on our territory," Gunnar said, his voice urgent as he pointed on a makeshift map he'd drawn in the dirt. "He's heading for the Heartstone." Alara's old legends described the Heartstone as the very nexus of their world, a place where the lines of magical power converged like the threads of a spider web. "If he performs his ritual there," Gunnar concluded, his face grim, "if he channels the power he stole from you through that stone, his magic will become absolute. He won't just be an Alpha King, he'll be a god, and he can remake the world in his own dark image." They had one chance. A single, desperate push to stop him before he could complete his ascension. Kael, no longer a broken exile but an alpha reforged by hope, stood beside Linda. He was her anchor, and she was his star. He reached out with his mind, not just to the scattered remnants of his own pack, but to all the packs in the region, even old rivals. He didn't send the command of an alpha demanding allegiance. He sent the plea of a mate, a desperate request for help to save their shared world from a creeping darkness. Liora, her voice now clear and strong, added her own message to his, a testament to Linda's sacrifice and the truth of the threat they all faced. "She saved me," Liora sent. "She is the daughter of the moon from the legends. The threat is real. We fight together, or we die alone." The response was hesitant at first, a trickle of wary acknowledgments. But as the story of Linda's death and rebirth spread, the trickle became a flood. A fragile, desperate alliance was born on the eve of battle. The strategy session that followed was unlike any Kael had ever led. Before, he was the sole commander. Now, he and Linda worked as two halves of a whole. Her newfound connection to the world's magic allowed her to feel the flow of power, to sense Corvus's plan as if it were a dark song on the wind. She could see his strategy. Kael, the master tactician, took her insights and forged them into a battle plan. It was a desperate gamble. Linda would have to face her brother alone at the Heartstone, using her own divine magic to try and sever him from the power he'd stolen. Kael and their new, fragile army would meet Corvus's forces head-on, buying her the precious time she would need. That night, as their small army rested, Kyle and Linda found a moment of peace alone overlooking the valley. The world was quiet, holding its breath before the coming storm. "I was a fool," Kael whispered, his voice thick with emotion as he took her hand. "For so long, I was bound by a duty I thought was my destiny. I was so afraid of failing Liora that I failed you. I saw you as a means to an end, and I almost lost everything because of it." He turned to her, his golden eyes shining with an unconditional love that took her breath away. "You are not a complication. You are the entire purpose. My world doesn't make sense without you in it." Linda's heart ached with a love so powerful, it felt like it could reshape the stars. She squeezed his hand, her own golden gaze meeting his. "Your past is part of you, Kael. The man who was so loyal to Liora is the same man who sacrificed his pack for me. I don't want you to erase that." She leaned in, her voice a soft promise. "We are not just a mark on the skin. We are a choice, and I choose you." She sealed her vow with a kiss, a tender, heartfelt promise of a future they would have to fight and bleed for. As the first rays of dawn broke over the horizon, their army began to stir. Linda looked up and saw that the moon, still visible in the morning sky, had a faint, crimson edge, a celestial omen of the blood that was about to be spilled. The final battle was here. Chapter 21. Heartstone and Shadow. The battle for the Heartstone began with a roar that shook the very foundations of the mountains. Kael, a golden-eyed whirlwind of righteous fury, led the charge. At his side were wolves from a half-dozen packs, warriors who had been his rivals just days ago, now united under a single desperate banner. They crashed into Corvus's army, and the clearing erupted into a maelstrom of claws, fangs, and flashing steel. Corvus's followers were unnaturally strong. their eyes glowing with the same sickly green-black energy as the ritual altar. But the allied packs fought with the desperation of those defending their very existence. While the savage battle raged, Linda moved like a ghost through the chaos. The fighting parted around her, her presence a bubble of intense, focused calm in the heart of the storm. Her destination was the center of the clearing, where a massive, crystalline stone, easily twice her height, pulsed with a soft internal light. The Heartstone. And waiting for her there, drawing power from the stone with every breath, was her brother. He looked different, his body twisted and augmented by the dark magic he had consumed. He was taller, his features sharper, and the shadows clung to him like a royal cloak. "Sister," Corvus greeted her, his voice a smooth, mocking purr. "You're looking radiant. Death becomes you." The need for answers, for understanding, was a raw ache in her chest. "Why?" she asked, her voice filled with the sorrow of 1,000 betrayals. "We were family. Why destroy everything?" Corvus laughed, a sound devoid of all humor. "Family?" he sneered. "Family is what a weak alpha like our father called his cage. He was content to hide his power, to let our divine lineage wither and die in obscurity. He praised your gentle healing magic, your connection to the light, while he scorned my ambition." His eyes narrowed, the jealousy of a lifetime burning in their depths. "He saw me as a threat. But you were his perfect, precious daughter of the moon. I am not destroying the world, little sister. I am taking what is rightfully mine, the power he was too afraid to claim." His pain, his twisted sense of being wronged, was a tragedy. But it was a tragedy he had chosen, and one he would drown the world in. There was nothing left to say. The time for words was over. Their duel began. It was a spectacular, terrifying display of creation versus corruption. Corvus wielded the shadows, the stolen life force, like a weapon. He threw bolts of black energy that sizzled through the air. He raised the corpses of fallen wolves to fight for him, their eyes glowing with his foul magic. Linda countered with the pure, divine light of her ancestry. She summoned shields of shimmering golden energy. She unleashed waves of power that turned his undead minions to dust. She healed the allied warriors from afar with pulses of benevolent light. But as she fought her brother, she felt the tide of the battle outside turning. Kael's forces were brave, but they were outnumbered and outmatched. Corvus's followers fought with a mindless fanaticism, fueled by a power that wasn't their own. Corvus saw it too. He saw an opening. With a triumphant, cruel smile, he gathered a massive ball of writhing black energy, a concentration of pure despair and death. And he didn't throw it at Linda. He hurled it across the battlefield, directly at Kael. Kael was engaged with 3 of Corvus's lieutenants, a whirlwind of deadly grace. He saw the attack coming, a black meteor of pure annihilation. He had a split second to choose: dodge the blow and let the warriors behind him perish, or stand his ground. It wasn't a choice. With a final, defiant roar, he braced himself, becoming a living shield for his men. The dark magic hit him with the force of an avalanche. His armor shattered. His body was thrown backward, a mortal wound tearing through his chest. He collapsed in a heap, his golden eyes full of shock and agony beginning to fade. Linda felt it through the bond. His life force, once a blazing sun, plummeted, its light flickering like a dying candle. The pain was a physical agony, a phantom blade plunging into her own chest, and it brought her to her knees with a choked scream. Corvus laughed, his victory absolute. "You see, sister?" he gloated, his voice echoing in the sudden lull of the battle. "Love is a weakness. Now you will watch him die, and then you will join him." Linda looked from the triumphant, monstrous face of her brother to her dying mate, and a terrible, beautiful, and absolute resolve filled her. She knew what she had to do. She knew the price of victory, and she was willing to pay it. Chapter 22. A soul for a soul. The world held its breath. The chaotic symphony of battle died into a stunned, ringing silence. Every eye, wolf, ally, and enemy, was fixed on the tableau at the Heartstone. Kael, their mighty alpha, was dying, a gaping, mortal wound in his chest. Corvus, a newly crowned god of shadow, stood triumphant, his laughter echoing in the sudden quiet. And Linda, the woman who had returned from death itself, was on her knees, her face a mask of incandescent grief. But as she looked from her dying mate to her gloating brother, the grief in her golden eyes burned away, replaced by a terrifying, beautiful, and absolute resolve. She rose to her feet, not with the fluid grace of a warrior, but with the slow, deliberate dignity of a queen ascending her throne. She did not look at her brother. Her entire universe, her entire being, was focused on Kael, on the flickering candle of his life force she could feel through their bond. She knew with a certainty that transcended magic and prophecy what she had to do. She had been a pawn, a prophecy, a sacrifice. Now she would be a creator. She would unmake fate and forge a new one with her own two hands. With a calmness that chilled the very air around her, she turned her back on her brother and placed her palms flat against the cold, crystalline surface of the Heartstone. The massive stone pulsed, ready to receive a command. Corvus watched, a flicker of confusion on his face. He expected an attack, a final, futile blast of divine light. He did not expect this. Linda closed her eyes and reached inward, gathering every last drop of her power. The divine spark of the first daughter, the ancient magic of her witch mother, the raw, untamed spirit of her own wolf. She gathered it all. And then, she gave it away. She didn't pull power from the Heartstone. She poured her own soul into it. A torrent of pure liquid gold, the very essence of her divinity, flowed from her hands into the crystal. The Heartstone blazed, no longer a gentle pulse but a miniature sun, and the clearing was flooded with a light so pure it was almost painful to behold. She was not attacking Corvus. She was overloading the entire system. She was using the Heartstone as a divine filter, a celestial crucible to burn away the darkness and reclaim what was stolen. Corvus screamed. It was a sound of pure, agonized rage as the power was ripped from him. The stolen life force, the dark magic he had used to fuel his ascension, was being siphoned back through the network he had created, but it could not survive the journey. The pure divine filter of the Heartstone and Linda's magic burned away the corruption. He was being consumed, not by an external enemy, but by his own avarice turned against him. He flared like a dying star, a vortex of black, corrosive energy, and then, with a final, echoing shriek, he was gone. Nothing remained but a fine layer of black dust that scattered on the wind. Simultaneously, the stolen life force, now purified, cleansed, and sanctified by the Heartstone, poured across the clearing in a gentle golden river of light. It flowed directly into Kael's body. The mortal wound in his chest vanished in a flash of warm light. The color returned to his face, his breathing deepened, and his eyes snapped open, blazing with a renewed, vibrant life. He was healed. He was whole. He was reborn. But the cost was immense. As the last of her divine power flowed out of her, Linda collapsed at the base of the stone, her body trembling with exhaustion. The brilliant, celestial glow in her eyes faded, the ancient golden light receding like a tide, leaving behind the familiar, warm, and wonderfully human brown he had first seen in the café. She had traded her divinity for his mortality. The bond between them, however, did not weaken. It flared, brighter and hotter than ever, a connection that was no longer about fate or power but about a choice, an ultimate sacrifice. The crimson mark on both their necks softened from a fiery blaze to a steady, warm, and permanent golden glow. Kael scrambled to his feet, his body overflowing with a strength he had never known, and rushed to her side. He gathered her limp form in his arms, his heart, once broken, now beating with a love so powerful it felt as though it could hold up the sky. The battle was over. But as he looked down at her tired, peaceful face, he knew their story was just beginning. Chapter 23. The Quiet. After the war. Silence descended on the battlefield, a heavy sacred blanket after the cacophony of war. The followers of Corvus, their dark master, turned to dust and their magical enhancements vanished, dropped their weapons in surrender or fled into the woods, their mindless fanaticism broken. The survivors of the allied packs, battered, bleeding but alive, slowly rose to their feet. They looked at the Heartstone, now pulsing with a gentle, clean light. They looked at the empty space where the dark Alpha King had stood. And they looked at Kael, holding the woman who had saved them all, and a collective, reverent awe fell over them. The hours that followed were a blur of quiet, necessary tasks. There was no victory celebration, only the somber work of tending to the wounded and honoring the dead, and at the forefront of it all was Linda. Though drained of her celestial power, her innate magic a mere whisper of what it had been, she was still a healer. With Kael constantly at her side, a silent, devoted guardian, she moved through the makeshift infirmary. Her touch was no longer a blinding flash of divine light. It was a warm, gentle, and deeply human comfort. She cleaned wounds, she set bones, she offered quiet words of solace. She was not a distant goddess or a feared prophecy anymore. She was a Luna, moving among her people with a grace and compassion that healed more than just their physical wounds. Later that day, as the sun began to set, the surviving alphas of the allied packs approached Kael. They did not see an exile. They did not see the disgraced leader of a rival pack. They saw the wolf who had united them, the commander who had led them in an impossible fight, the mate of the woman who had saved their world. One by one, they bowed their heads, not in submission, but in a profound, heartfelt gesture of respect and fealty. "You are our Alpha King now," the oldest of them declared, his voice rough with emotion. "Not by birthright or conquest, but by merit and sacrifice. We follow you, and we follow your Luna." Kael looked at Linda, and he knew his pack was no longer just the Northern Moon. It was all of them. A new, united nation forged in the crucible of battle. As if summoned by the thought, Liora appeared. She walked toward them, her steps light, her face serene. The last vestiges of the curse were gone, and with them, the weight of a destiny she had never truly wanted. She looked at Kael and Linda, at the way they stood together, two perfect interlocking pieces of the same soul, and she smiled. It was a genuine, radiant smile, free of all sorrow and jealousy. "I am so happy for you both," she said, and her sincerity was a gift. "The pack will need a true Luna to guide them." She then looked at Kael, her expression peaceful. "But my path is my own now. I am not a Luna anymore. I am just Liora. And for the first time in my life, I am free to find out who that is." The moment was a quiet, gentle release, a final closing of a chapter, freeing all three of them from the ghosts of a duty that no longer existed. With the immediate chaos settling, Kael finally turned all of his attention to Linda. The weight of his new title, Alpha King, felt heavy on his shoulders, but it was nothing compared to the overwhelming weight of his love for her. He looked at her, truly looked at her. The faint smudge of dirt on her cheek, the exhaustion in her warm brown eyes, the incredible strength in her quiet spirit. He cupped her face in his hands, his voice a low, rough whisper full of a raw, desperate truth. "You weren't my second chance, Linda," he said, his golden eyes shining with unshed tears. "You were my only one, my only chance at any of this making sense." The confession, so simple and so profound, hung in the quiet air, a promise of the life that was waiting for them, a life they had earned. Chapter 24. Just a choice, weeks bled into a month. The world, scarred but not broken, began to heal. Under Kael's quiet, steady leadership, the newly united packs started to rebuild, not just their homes, but a foundation of trust that had been shattered for generations. He was a good king, a wise leader, a respected alpha. But the heartstone of his new kingdom was missing, because Linda was not there. The gentle, familiar chime of a small bell broke the morning quiet. The scent of freshly ground espresso and baked cinnamon filled the air. Linda Ravenhart wiped down the polished surface of a marble countertop, her movements calm and rhythmic. She was back. Back in her small café, the daily grind. The broken door had been replaced, the shattered window repaired. It was once again her sanctuary, a quiet island of normalcy in a sea of impossible memories. She had needed to come back here, to this place where her entire world had been torn apart and then remade. She needed to stand in this room to smell the coffee, to feel the worn wood under her feet, and remember who she was. Not a prophecy, not a goddess, not a Luna. Just Linda. The bell chimed again. Her heart didn't leap, it settled. She knew who it was without even looking up. Kael filled the doorway, a mountain of a man who somehow managed not to block out all the light. He wasn't wearing the leather armor of an alpha or the ceremonial furs of a king. He was in a simple pair of jeans and a soft gray Henley that stretched across his broad chest. He looked for all the world like a man who had just stopped in for a cup of coffee. But the quiet, immense power was still there, a gentle hum beneath his skin, and his golden eyes, full of a soft, patient love, were only for her. He didn't speak at first. He just took in the sight of her, in her element, looking peaceful and whole. He walked slowly to the counter, his gaze sweeping over the familiar, cozy details of the little shop where his life had been saved in more ways than one. He finally stopped in front of her, the marble counter the only thing separating them. "I spent the last few weeks setting up a council," he said, his voice a low, gentle rumble. "Gunnar is the head. The other alphas have representatives. They can govern. They can keep the peace." He was telling her that the world would not fall apart without him, that he had made sure of it. He had done it all so he could be standing here, in this moment. He did it so he could offer her a choice, a real one. With no lives hanging in the balance, no prophecies hanging over their heads. He reached across the counter and took her hand. It was the hand that had wiped down 1,000 tables, the hand that had held his heart together when it was breaking. He brought it to his lips and pressed a soft, reverent kiss to her knuckles. His eyes flickered to the golden mark on her neck, no longer a brand of fate, but a warm, glowing testament to their journey. "No more fate," he whispered, his voice thick with an emotion so deep it was an ocean. "No more destiny. No more marks that decide for us." He looked directly into her warm brown eyes, his soul completely bare, his heart in his hands. "Just a choice." His voice dropped, a plea and a promise all in one. "Choose me, Linda." A radiant, beautiful smile spread across her face, a sunrise after the longest night. She didn't need to say a word. Her answer was in the way she leaned across the counter, across the last small barrier between them, and pressed her lips to his. It wasn't a kiss of desperate passion or relieved survival. It was a kiss of quiet certainty, of homecoming, of a love that had been tested by gods and monsters and had emerged not just intact, but perfected. The moon began to rise in the window behind them, its gentle silver light bathing the two figures in the small café, two souls who had been to hell and back, finally beautifully and completely free.